And we will go ahead and get started. Good morning. Hello. Welcome to the 2020 Southeast Collaborative Online Conference. My name is Tiffany Hayes. I'm with the South Carolina State Library, and I will be your host for this session. And today we are honored to have Kaetrena Davis Kendrick speaking about low morale in libraries. This event is supported through funding from the Library Services and Technology Act through the Institute of Museum and Library Services. And before we get started, let me just remind you of a few things. The session will be recorded and archived, and we will be sending out a link probably next week with that archived session. If there are other people watching along with you in the room, we'd love to hear about it so that we can give them credit as well. So send an email and let us know who all is there. As most of you have found, you can type questions in the chat box and we will pass those along to the presenter. And if you're in a state that does CEUs, such as Georgia, we will give you a certificate for your CEUs. Just we'll keep that in mind. And now I'm going to go ahead and turn this over to Kaetrena. Go right ahead whenever you're ready.
Thank you so much, Tiffany. Thank you so much for inviting me to speak this morning. And I'm really happy and honored to talk with all of you about my research. So my name is Kaetrena Davis Kendrick. I'm a researcher, facilitator, and leader. And I'm going to talk with you about my ongoing research about low morale in libraries. I have a lot to cover today. So keeping in mind that this will be recorded, keep that in mind, and you can ask questions really at any time. I'm looking very much forward to having an ongoing conversation with this topic with you. So today we're going to review my original study, which was published in 2017, and then talk about associated frameworks about low morale that kind of show up through this experience or connect to this experience. I'll summarize the development of a low morale experience, and I'll then introduce to you, I'm really excited to introduce to you my new low morale studies that I've recently completed and I'm continuing to do, and discuss countermeasures, and we'll end with that. And that is also a call for you to consider and share your own countermeasures. One thing that does come out of this research consistently is the countermeasures come from people who are experiencing this event or this phenomenon in their workplace. And then at the end, I'll reveal my ongoing research on low morale and workplace and organizational change as it pertains to all types of libraries. So what is low morale? Well, historically, low morale, when people think of it, they think of ideas and feelings surrounding respect at work, lack of recognition about the work that they're doing, unclear expectations in their job, leadership problems, and usually that comes out of communication. And then also organizational changes. So perhaps people are dealing with lots of rapid organizational change or inconsistencies with organizational change. Historically, when we talk about low morale as a concept, an abstract concept, these are the ideas that have come up when people talk about it and in the literature, like for instance, from Brunn and Cooper. But what we now know from my study on low morale from the 2017 study is experientially, low morale is the result of repeated and protracted exposure to emotional, verbal and written, and system abuse or negligence in the workplace. And I want you to be mindful here that it could be these types of abuse and or negligence. And the interesting thing about negligence is when people were talking to me, they weren't considering this part. But the negligence part came out as I was analyzing the study, as I was analyzing the data and realizing people weren't realizing that the negligence was part of the abuse cycle. So abuse is negligence is a form of abuse. So I want you to go ahead already with just that little tidbit. Negligence is a form of abuse, so be mindful of that. When we consider the experiential nature of low morale, there are low morale links to other things that you might have been hearing about in the library literature or in literature about workplaces in general. Incivility and toxicity, bullying and mobbing. There's also this framework of resilience narratives. I'll talk about that shortly. You might have heard of this term called vocational awe, and I'll share with you more about that. And then also job precarity, the idea that for many working in libraries, their jobs are not safe. They don't have benefits. They're transient, they're contractual, and all of the non-protections associated with not having a stable employment or a stable outlook on your employment in libraries. So let me talk to you a little bit more about those last 3 bullets. I call those the frameworks that kind of are associated with the experience of low morale. The first one is resilience narratives. And you can be typing. I'm also monitoring here, so you might see me do this. So if you have things or responses to these ideas in real time, feel free to share them. And of course, I'll be answering questions at the end of our time together. So have you ever heard of doing more with less? Resilience narratives also stress that individuals should be held responsible for system failures. So for instance, if you are overworked, it's your fault that you're not able to hang. You don't have the grit required to just handle the impacts of being overworked. Have you ever thought about that or seen that happen? Or maybe that language has been given to you in some sort of form, or you've heard it offered in other workplaces. It also depoliticizes the structures. It makes it think that everyone comes to work with the same amount of barriers, the same issues, the same concerns, and they all play out the exact same way in a workplace. So it makes it seem like, well, everyone should respond to stress the same way, and everyone should respond to merit the same way. Merit, everything is the same. That's part of the resilience narrative. It also normalizes insecurity. It's okay. It's normal that we don't have what we need in the workplace. It's normal that people don't respond to requests or concerns in the workplace or don't create these policies. It's normal that we have insecurity in these various and sundry ways they show up in our workplaces. Resilience narratives normalize those ideas. Generally, resilience narratives also marginalized groups that are already vulnerable. So generally, when we're talking about resilience narratives, the people whom are likely to be most impacted are women, Black people, Indigenous people, and people of color, people who have different gender fluidities. Any group that you can think of that is generally already marginalized in some sort of way, economically, politically, socially, racially. The people in those that you are thinking of when you think about those categories, they are going to be also more impacted by the negative effects of resilience narratives. I mentioned job precarity just a moment ago. Job precarity is contractual, ambiguous, insecure, unprotected, and or poorly paid labor, work, or employment. So from everybody from, say, in our academic libraries, you might be thinking of adjunct faculty, student workers, temporary employees, contractual workers, people that are outsourced workers. Think about these folks and how might this affect them if they're also going through workplace abuse and neglect. What are those outcomes for them when they're dealing with this experience? This is an emerging area of practice, and it also has correlates with negative mental health impacts. And again, job precarity is also more likely to impact already marginalized people. And of course, there's a negative impact on library structure, operations, and development, because if we are mostly contractual people we can move in and out of places, what does that mean for our daily operations? Can we stay open from 24/7? Can we stay open even from 8:30 in the morning to 5 o'clock if that person can be let go at any time? Do we continue to, and that's a lot of labor in the administrative paperwork of consistently creating new contracts for people to continue working. What does that mean for training? I'm sure there are other ways you can think of that job precarity affects how our libraries operate. Vocational awe, Fabazi Ettar wrote in the library with the lead pipe. Her idea is that vocational awe is the idea that libraries as institutions are inherently good. It assumes that some or all core aspects of the library profession are beyond critique, and it in turn underpins many librarians' sense of identity and emotional investment in the profession. So consider what are some values that libraries or librarians have, or that the library field propagates, that intersect or could actually cause low morale in your libraries. I want you to be thinking about that. Okay. One of them is libraries are neutral. How might that impact how we do our work when we are being exposed to, say, someone who's abusive or neglectful. So think of some other ideas, some library values that are actually sound good, that are good, but actually play into how we see ourselves as librarians. Another thing is, a lot of times, the idea that we are here to serve, librarians serve. How might that be weaponized against library employees as they do their work from day to day? I'd like to share with you and go into the low morale experience. Let's talk about low morale development. Um, Low morale starts with a trigger event, and it's unexpected. It often IDs that coworker who started the trigger event, or initiates that trigger event, as an abuser or a person who's neglectful. And there are short-term emotional and physiological effects. So it's unexpected, and say you were having a neutral or positive relationship with a coworker, and something occurs, and then you realize, oh, maybe you had that, oh, what the heck? And there are immediate psychological, emotional, and physiological effects. So you'll probably feel, a lot of people have said, they use the word blindsided. And then right after the blindsided, that blindsided created concerns like confusion, anger, and then fear comes a little bit later, because first you're angry because it's like, what? And then they get scared, like, now what does this mean? Is this person gonna do it again? And a trigger event is different from a bad day at work. So some folks often ask me, well, so what? A trigger event is different from a bad day at work. A bad day at work, I work with my colleague, Rebecca, if we're having a bad day at work, that's going to be easily resolved. I might come to her, or if something happens, let's say we have an argument, that argument will be resolved and we'll be back on our positive and or neutral relationship status within 24 hours to 48 hours, because someone is going to come and say, hey, I was hungry, I was tired, or, I went back and I looked at that and I was wrong. Let's revisit this. A trigger event happens and there's no context for it. And then later on, people realize that that was the start of a cycle of abuse or neglect. So the person or other persons begin realizing this is a cycle, that they're being consistently exposed to abusive situations or neglectful situations. So I hope that's clear for everyone, and you can ask questions about that if you do. So again, there are different types of repeated, protracted abuse and neglect. So there's a trigger event, and then there's a cycle. And throughout that cycle, when folks are realizing that there's more instances of abuse or neglect, there are several categories of abuse and or neglect, of abuse, that come up. And they are emotional, verbal, written, system, and then negligence. So these cause intense emotional, physiological, and then cognitive responses. And cognitive responses are the marker of a low morale experience, okay? There are things that that you're doing in response to the abuse or neglect. People also begin thinking about, maybe it's not just my job, maybe it's the field in general. Oh, I misunderstood the nature of the library and information science practice and field overall. I should be rethinking whether I should even stay in this field and practice. Okay. As we move forward, when people begin realizing that they're having reactions to this, when I say cognitive, we know that we're doing things. And one of those is coping strategies. So coping strategies are conscious and or unconscious and positive or negative behaviors that victims engage in to reduce the impact of the low morale experience that they're having. The actions do not affect abusers and do not impact necessarily how the low morale experience trajectory plays out. So some positive or negative items could be taking yoga, doing yoga, right? That's a positive coping strategy. But does that prevent or stop the person who's abusing you or neglecting you at your job? No, it does not. It makes you feel better, but it doesn't do anything about what's happened at work. Or you might start overeating. You might not be aware that you're doing it. Again, that overeating might, quote unquote, help you feel better, do the carbs or whatever the addiction that comes up as a part of that overeating is. But again, it doesn't affect what's happening at work. So those are coping strategies. The other thing that people may start to do is mitigation methods. Mitigation methods are different. They are conscious and deliberate behaviors victims perform to end or resolve their experiences. These methods directly impact the abusers or the organization and address or engage enabling systems. And we'll talk about enabling systems here shortly. So a mitigation method would be going to HR or documenting someone's behavior. So you can have a documentation and maybe use that later in some sort of complaint or concern. Looking for another job, though, is by far the number one mitigation method. People just start looking for new work. What does that mean for the viability and operations of our libraries? Enabling systems are behaviors or organizational cultures, structures, policies, or ethoses that inadvertently enforce or underpin low morale experiences. And I call these enabling systems the same way if you if you understand the context of interventions for addiction. Enablers feel like they're helping, but often they're preventing the person who's an addict or addicted to something, or they prevent that person from getting the help they really need because they're intervening early in a different way to enable that action. Enabling systems work in the same way. They're there generally to help. They could be helping reduce, but they generally end up creating more opportunities for abuse and neglect in our workplaces. The impact factors there are also impact factors in the low morale experience, and those impact factors broadly are something I call insidiousness, and the other one is contagion. Insidiousness is it creates this phenomenon happens slowly. It takes a while for people to realize that they're being systematically abused or neglected. And because that is happening slowly, people can't defend themselves as well as they could had they realized they were being abused. So if we think about vocational awe, one of the ideas about vocational awe is librarians are nice, and that can't, or people who work in libraries are nice, and libraries are places that where violence generally doesn't happen between colleagues anyway. So when people generally are faced with abuse, that first instance, the first few instances, they fall back on, well, maybe, they didn't mean, that person didn't mean, maybe it's something else. So it takes them a while before they recognize and understand that they are being systematically abused and or neglected. Contagion is when a person going through a low morale experience, going through workplace abuse and neglect, realizes that other people are being abused or neglected, and or they begin abusing or neglecting others as a defense mechanism for trying to avoid being abused and neglected themselves. So perhaps you've seen someone join in certain behaviors, and what they're doing is a defense mechanism so they won't be targeted. They're trying not to be targeted. It doesn't mean it's right, but it's called contagion, and it can happen. Enabling systems for academic libraries include promotion and tenure, human resources limitations. This is a big one where people go to human resources and they feel like nothing's being done, or human resources really doesn't take them seriously. Staffing and employment, and that plays out in people were often abused because there was not enough staff, and that would be weaponized against them. So one person would work, say, 12-hour shifts, and no one would come in, and they couldn't take care of themselves or go eat or anything. So that's a form of neglect, right? And it's a form of abuse. And that was weaponized against them, rather than the administration say coming in and bringing in more people. It would just be do more with less, right? So now we see how the resilience narrative works. LIS perceptions and leadership. So say if I, as a librarian, say that another librarian is bothering me, well, people outside of our profession also think certain things of librarians, and librarians are meek and quiet, and we don't fight. So those complaints might not be taken seriously. And also another one is leadership in general, not taking care of people. And there are certain types of leadership styles that are more likely to enable a workplace abuse and neglect: authoritarian leadership, totalitarian leadership, toxic leadership, and what I call laissez-faire leadership. Perhaps you might know of people who work in places where their leader is not available often, always away, or just I call it the real, like, oh, it'll be fine. You tell them a complaint, it'll work out, it'll be fine. That sort of thing. And then another enabling system is something called uncertainty and mistrust. And this is by far the most pervasive, most damning enabling system, because it starts in that current job where people are dealing with the workplace abuse and neglect, and that uncertainty and mistrust moves forward with that person to their next position. It takes a person a very long time to realize or trust their new colleagues. It takes a long time for people, if they have been, their self-esteem has been battered, their professional confidence is lower than that original position where they experienced that neglect or abuse. It takes a very long time for them to realize, I can do this job. I was doing everything correctly, and I'm doing everything correctly now. So uncertainty and mistrust is a huge enabling factor. Perhaps you can understand that. Recovery is long term, again, because of the uncertainty and mistrust. It can remain unresolved. For instance, let's say you develop hypertension or high blood pressure as a result of the stress of working under an abusive organization. If you experience or develop hypertension at one place, just because you go to a new position doesn't mean all of a sudden you don't have hypertension anymore. So you might still be on that medication or running that protocol for your health for years, months, even though you already left the job where it originally manifested. And there are also physical and mental health implications. People have let me know that they experience clinical depression, PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, comes up as a constant thread. And at least one person, and every time I've done this study, and I've done it 4 times now, has told me that they considered suicide, up to ideation of how they were going to continue it, how they were going to end their lives, all due to what happened to them in the library workplace. In terms of impact on practice, reduce collegiality, because generally if you're being abused and neglected, do you treat your colleagues professionally? Probably not. Reduce professional confidence, which just is a nice way of saying people are not sure they are even qualified to do the work. They begin feeling like they can't do the work anymore. They start questioning if they are able to do library work. Increased procrastination. One person even did something I called planned procrastination. People start purposefully not doing their work on time. Increased absenteeism, reduced professional engagement. In terms of health, people have developed hypertension, anxiety, depression, PTSD, and if they already had previously diagnosed conditions, those symptoms were exacerbated and made worse by the low morale experience they were having. I'm really excited to share with you the new studies that I've been doing. The one that just came out, I did one with Ione Damasco out of the University of Dayton. I wanted to hear from racial and ethnic minority librarians. I didn't have a large presentation of them in my original study, so I went back and I asked to speak to academic librarians from racial and ethnic minority groups to tell me about their experiences. These also brought up issues of LIS recruitment, retention, and advancement issues. That still remains a huge problem for Black, Indigenous, and people of color, people who bringing them into our profession. We have not moved 1 inch, and in some cases have moved backwards in terms of these areas that librarians and the library profession say is important to them. It also brings up issues about equity, diversity, and inclusion concerns. And there's also this issue about the recent past of BIPOC welcomeness in library field generally, and in libraries. We know that people are still not welcome in our libraries and in LIS when we look at these diversity numbers and read news reports about how BIPOC are treated in our libraries and our community spaces. What I can share with you is that the experience and impacts that I've already just explained to you have been validated. They recurred for this group. Racial and ethnic minority librarians are more likely to experience emotional and system abuse during trigger events, and they're more likely to experience system abuse and negligence during the trajectory that they have. So remember, there's a trigger event response, and then during the trajectory, there are other responses. So those are some differences right away. Except for one, staffing and employment, all enabling systems were again validated for this group. There are also additional impact factors for racial and ethnic minority librarians. One is stereotype threat. Stereotype threat happens when folks of minorities or people who are more likely to have negative stereotypes attributed to them, or people who are their culture or their ethnicity or their race, they begin engaging in behaviors to distance themselves from negative racial stereotypes. So you might hear people of color and Black and Indigenous people saying, I have to prove myself to show myself a better as than or as good as, or I might not do certain things so people won't connect those negative stereotypes about who they think I am to me. There's also something that was very interesting that happens for racial and ethnic minorities that I think everyone needs to be aware of in terms of additional things that they bring to work with them. And in this case, it's things that they choose not to bring to work with them, which is in and of itself another burden to bear. And that is called de-authentication. So it's when people of color, Black and Indigenous people, consciously hide natural aspects of their physical appearance, cultural background and traditions, and other things to avoid undue roles of culture bearing, or to avoid macro or microaggressions, retaliation, shaming, or other punishment or attention in the workplace. So imagine what that means when we connect with people, or are required to connect with people so we can give them information and have a rapport with them on the other side of the reference desk, or with your other colleagues. Imagine all the things that they choose to hide, we choose to hide because we don't want to be retaliated against or asked to explain things. So that's called de-authentication. And I call it de-authentication with contrast to authenticity, which means that people can bring their whole selves to work. So what essentially this is racial and ethnic minorities do not bring their whole selves to work. They feel that that is a privilege, and and furthermore, they see it as a privilege that Caucasians can do. The interesting thing about this is, in the original study, insidiousness and contagion are externally motivated, predicated by what people are doing outside. And for this group, these impact factors are internally motivated and are defense mechanisms against hostile or unwelcoming workplaces. So I think that's something that you want to take note of as well. Additional enabling systems, and I want to be clear, these are additional enabling systems outside of in addition to the ones that this group validated from the original study, all right? These are additional enabling systems. Diversity rhetoric. We say we want diversity, and we have all these statements, but when we try to enact it, there's pushback. So that creates a sense of cognitive dissonance for this group. And you know the word tokenism, that we are often used as tokens, which is not authentic EDI work. And then they also recognize a lot that their colleagues were pushing back against EDI, that a lot of folks, just because we say it, individuals don't necessarily mean it or want to. There are lots of librarians who don't believe in EDI, who don't want to work on EDI. And that comes out and is very clear to racial and ethnic minority librarians, and it feeds into their low morale experiences. Whiteness in libraries, this profession remains overrepresented in women, and in particular white women, and they perceive white women as abusers and upholders of the systems that keep everyone from moving forward. There's also included in that white privilege and a lack of intersectionality. So I want to be clear that the original idea of intersectionality means that Black women are erased. They can't be Black and women at the same time. The systems privilege you have to be one or the other. And so if whole people are being erased, whereas both of those markers are essential to how Black women are treated. They see us as Black women, but yet the systems, when you're trying to make it equitable, generally will say you got to pick one or the other. And so intersectionality really is the erasure of women, Black women, in systems of equality. So that affects people as they deal with low morale. Okay, when they're trying to assert that, no, this is happening because I'm Black and this, or I'm Black and something, or I'm Native American and something. All right, there's not an intersectionality when we consider these systems and what's happening in libraries. White supremacy is different from whiteness. White supremacy is kind of acting on superiority, where whiteness is invisible, but white supremacy is something that that generally we understand that white people recognize as I'm better, I'm at the top. So out of white supremacy comes acts of paternalism. Paternalism means that the participants in the study stated, well, people would try to tell me what was best for me and try to tell me what to do as if I'm not a whole person. You know, a lot of people come to libraries in their second careers. They are whole people, adults who know how to move about the workplace, but they felt like they were being treated like children. And then also folks recognize that their institutions whitewash and hide instances of how they've treated communities of color as they've grown their institutions. Racism is acting upon your feelings of inferiority of someone else. You can whiteness, so white supremacy and racism are different. You can show yourself as I believe you're superior and never engage in an instance of racism. Racism is when you engage in an act that actively suppresses someone due to your feelings that you think that they're inferior to you because of their race, ethnicity, or some other marker. So that comes into people felt like they were being stereotyped. There were microaggressions, which are inverse compliments, stating some sort of racist idea and say, oh, you're not like that, right? Oppression, actively keeping someone from succeeding, even if you didn't have anything to do with what they're doing. They noticed that. And then also phenotype reliance. So a lot of people who identified as multiracial, but who favored white phenotypes, other librarians would talk negatively about other librarians. And it wasn't until that person said, well, actually, I'm part so-and-so. And then that person would realize that they made a social faux pas and revealed themselves as a racist. So that was also talked about in this study. Additional enabling systems include career environmental landscapes. So that included things like they recognized that sometimes they were living in a hostile campus and in the living communities around that campus. So for instance, I work in the South and I often see Confederate flags everywhere. And so that's a marker to me as an African American that I might not be safe in these communities, yet I come to work in this community every day. So am I safe when I go out there to the community? I don't know. It's something that they think about when they come to work. Another one is working in homogenous workplaces. Say, for instance, that meant that they might have been the only person of color working in the building, in the library, and or conversely, they realized that there were a lot of students of color coming to the school, but that it wasn't represented in the library worker pool. So I hope that makes sense. So the homogenous workplaces was two-pronged. One, that they were the only one working there, of color working there, and or there were all these students of color, and that was not reflected in the library employee makeup. That bothered them. The results of the 2016 U.S. presidential elections results and subsequent educational, social, and civil rights assault weighs heavily on this group as they continue their practice. They noticed that they didn't feel safe sometimes working in communities that were seen as, that are often labeled as politically conservative. And they often wonder what that meant for their practice, especially if they're working at places like Hispanic serving institutions where there might be undocumented students. And that fear for the students might have also played into how they were trying to serve the students, and they carry some of that anxiety with them. Another enabling system is collegiality. Racial and ethnic minority librarians perceive that there's no support from their colleagues. They also noted credit stealing of their work, downplaying of their work, and other things like that, that would just be perceived as uncollegial and unsupportive. And within that connection was something called oppressed group behavior, which now I believe probably happens more writ large. I'm thinking about looking more into this. But oppressed group behavior happens comes out of the nursing literature. And basically, it basically is a form of hazing. So you watch a new member of the profession come in and perform or have difficulty, and you just watch them and offer no support. And or you create barriers to them doing their work so they can, quote unquote, prove that they're able to be a librarian, right? So if you've heard of that, it also happens for this group. This didn't show up in the original study, but in the study for racial and ethnic minority librarians, it did show up. So this group tends to also be more likely to be on the receiving end of oppressed group behavior. So if we keep score, the original study says 2 impact factors and 6 enabling systems. Black, Indigenous, and PLC have 4 impact factors and a whopping 12 enabling systems. Let's look at public librarians. I decided to look at public librarians because I was interested in that. There are differences in the daily practice of a public librarian versus academic librarian. They also have different organizational structures than academic libraries do, and there are different stakeholders. And also the idea of larger community roles and perceptions. So that's why I decided to look at public librarians. Let me share with you what I found. Again, experience and trajectory impacts validated. Everything came out again. This is all the other areas of types of abuse were also validated. But in terms of abuse, when we look at differences, this is the only group to report physical abuse and myriad abuse from library users. This is the only group that has shared with me within the low morale experience that they have. Number one, a new category of abuse, physical abuse, and then also verbal and physical abuse from library users. That's very significant. In terms of enabling systems, promotion and tenure wouldn't shake out because that is a process unique to academia, so I didn't expect it. So it's not here, but all the other things were validated again. All the other enabling systems were validated again, the original enabling systems, except for promotion and tenure. Public librarians also have additional impact factors. Let me share them with you. One, and these are in no particular order, personal safety. Personal safety. Exposure to weapons, bodily fluid, proximity to physical violence, and associated stigmas that could create physical violence. So mental health issues and things like drug, substance use issues, things like that. This group discussed, they are very concerned about their personal safety and how that plays out. Why? And remember, this is while they're dealing with workplace abuse and neglect in the system, in the library itself. So I need to be clear with you when I'm talking about enabling systems. I need you to remember that enabling systems are going on while people are being exposed to abuse and neglect in the workplace, perhaps from other colleagues or organizational systems at the workplace. I want that to be clear. So personal safety. They also brought up the resilience narratives. They often feel self-blame for organizational and system failures. Leadership feel guilt from their leaders will make them feel guilty about why things aren't being done or when they ask for help. They are punished often for exposing these failures. The expectations of immediate recovery from constant exposure to the public and patron abuse. So let's say you come in at Monday morning at 100% and a huge thing happens on Monday and you're still expected to come to work at another 100% on Tuesday, as if that big, huge thing with that patron did not happen on Monday. You're expected to come in and have another reservoir of 100% ready for you to tap into all week. And that does not happen. But you're expected to do that. That's a resilience narrative that you should be ready. You're not strong enough to have, you should have a reservoir, right? That will be part of a resilience narrative. You should have a reservoir of ready and available energy for you to always be at work at 100%, even if something happened with your personal safety or you witnessed something else with someone else's trauma. You should still be coming in every day at 100% ready to go. There are also social contexts that affect public librarians as they deal with low morale in the workplace. Some of those are consistent exposure to the impacts of houselessness, more commonly known as homelessness, exposure to the impacts of mental illness and the associated stigmas there, and drug overuse and associated stigmas there. The awareness of a lack of social services that they can provide in their communities. This is particularly concerning for librarians, public librarians working in rural areas, that they are expected to kind of just have these offer some sort of social service, and there are no social service to even refer them to patrons to. And also constant updates and changes in policies to address associated patron behaviors. So there were these constant, they noticed that their things were not being done holistically, but we will update the policy. Oh, something else happens. Oh, change the policy again, rather than just looking at the policy holistically and trying to figure out a more efficient way, an inclusive way of dealing with whatever the patron behavior that was concerning is, but also being ethical about what the code of ethics says that we should be doing in our communities, instead of just constantly changing things every day. So, and then not everybody not even necessarily knowing about those changes from branch to branch to branch. Other enabling systems include organizational structures. Participants talked about having constant leadership changes or cultures that were resistant to changes. How this often played out is public librarians would have directors for years, decades, and or the public librarians, the directors would be insular, hiring people they know instead of hiring for competence or skill set or vision or whatever those things are. They would hire people they know. So cronyism played into the cultures that were resistant to change. And so there's no change happening, then it's hard to respond to abuse and neglect. And then also the very real push-pull of municipalities and boards of trustees who may or may not necessarily know the best way to how to run libraries, although they might very well believe in the power and impact of libraries. They're not necessarily the best folks to run the libraries, and they make sometimes they make these decisions for the libraries in these municipalities and or boards of trustees. So that came out in the participant data. Library workplace culture. Participants mentioned having cliques and silos, and also expectations of homogenized behaviors and fit. So if you don't act this way or toe this line, then that means you're not one of us, and so therefore we can bully you or mean girl you or gossip about you and things like that. And also, if you don't fit, this is the way we can decide who's going to work in our library. So if they look like us, act like us, talk like us, that means that they're a competent person and can work for us. So it's not about whether they have the person who's applying has a skill set to do the work. It's about whether this person fits in with our already established social group or things that we care about socially, rather than what's the professional outlook for this position or library. Another thing that came up is this idea of on-demand relocation. And that basically means the public libraries, when you are hired into a public library, that means you can be assigned to any branch in the system. Well, generally they would say, well, they told me I would have 2 weeks notice. If I was going to be moved, they would tell me they would give me the justification and then give me enough time to finish up what I'm doing here and move to the new branch. But in the low morale experience, what people told me is that this was often used as without notice. They would tell you, oh, next week you can go into a branch across town. And they also perceived it as a form of retaliation punishment. So this is where the idea of the enabling system worked, because on-demand location could work and could be very helpful. If this person is abusing you, I'm gonna move you to the next nearest location. But what really happened is, well, since you're telling it and you're seen as the problem, we're gonna punish you and figure out a way to make sure nobody ever hears about it. So we're gonna move you across town where it's very likely that no one will know what happened at this branch here, where we're moving you from. Policies are also enabling system. Either they were often non-existent, hard to find, inconsistently enforced, and lack of support of enforcement by branch managers or library directors. And also training. Most people said that they generally did not have a formal training procedure. They were just thrown on the desk or thrown in the public service area, and you learned as you go. You asked questions as you went along. And equity, diversity, and inclusion. People of color who responded to this study also discussed, similarly to the racial and ethnic minority discussion, tokenism, white privileging, and most of all, pigeonholing. Pigeonholing is one, for instance, one Latina librarian said, well, I can do a lot more, but they only want me to work with the Spanish speaking population, but I speak English, so why can't I do this other thing too and help out? So that was that pigeonholing. And then again, politics came up, but for this group, uptick in meaner and angrier patrons and worried and scared community members. And that circles back to social services. They can't necessarily help them because either nothing's available or there's not nowhere to send them. And then just taking on that anxiety of, even if I'm being helpful to someone, I notice that people are just nastier in general. Even if I say, can I help? One person said to a patron, how may I help you? And the response was very nasty. And that person just asked, what can I do for you today? And the response was nasty. And they used and that person, a lot of people mentioned specifically that the upticks in mean and anger from patrons, when they did speak meanly or nastily, they specifically mentioned that those persons or patrons used the rhetoric of the current federal administration or use the language that is shared or propagated by the current president. So as we keep score, again, we see original, 2 impact factors, 6 enabling systems, BIPOC, 4 impact factors, 12 enabling systems, public librarians, 5 impact factors, 12 enabling systems. There are some countermeasures, and these are the things that I've noticed doing this research for a while. Assertive communication. Assertive communication means that you protect your dignity and protect the dignity of the person with whom you are talking. Librarians generally have a problem doing this. We're really concerned about how people perceive us, and that perception and worry about how people perceive us often allows us and gives us license to not be assertive in our communication. So I encourage you to take assertive communication courses, learn about assertive communication, and then enact assertive communication when you talk with people. Informal leadership. Just because you're not a formal leader does not mean you cannot lead. I have no formal leader at my library, yet there's a leader in this library there too. So a lack of form, just whether or not you have a formal leader or don't, you can lead. So be your own leader. Boundaries are important. Boundaries mean focus. Know what you're going to do and know what you're not going to do, and figure out ways to make sure that people don't cross the boundaries. Boundaries could mean I'm just leaving every day at the end of my shift. Today I'm taking a lunch, and nothing's going to stop me from eating this delicious salad because I'm eating today. Okay. The role of shame is a big deal here. Shame is usually hidden as anger or sadness, because we don't want to admit that someone has treated us poorly. And by proxy, abusers are also fueled by shame. They are trying to hide some insecurity. And I can talk with you more about that. Be sure to take care of yourself, but also focus on self-preservation. Self-preservation are things you do in a moment when someone is abusing or attempting to abuse or neglect you. So yes, take care of yourself, eat your lunch, take your breaks, all those things. Go get your nails done or your hair done, or take your day off, or whatever you need to do. Make sure you have time for yourself, whatever those things are, but also preserve yourself. Know what you're going to do if someone tries to or attempts to abuse you or neglect you. Well, know what you're going to do in that moment when that instance happens. Also, we need safe community online spaces. A lot of people like to talk about it, but they're afraid because somebody might go back and say something. So I've created a safe online space to do that. That's something that needs to happen writ large in our profession. If you can think of others, please share them. As I said at the beginning, a lot of the countermeasures come from the people who are experiencing them, and they're highly individualized, in part because people have different experiences and respond to them individually. But these are some that are seen to be common that I've noticed and been recording since I've started this research. My ongoing work. I am currently doing my 4th study, and that is focusing on leaving low morale experiences. I've just finished data collection for that, and I'll be working on the data analysis at the summer. Before that, I mentioned that I have done my racial and ethnic minority librarian study that was published in January in Library Trends, and you see the information there. For people of color, BIPOC, if you'd like to take the de-authenticity survey, that's always open for you to do. I am waiting to hear back on the status of the public librarians study. You can go look at the emerging data presentation I did last year at Libris, and you can also do a spot check about what's going on with you right now and share your strategies. So those are the links that public librarians can engage in. For academic librarians, again, that original study was published in 2017 in the Journal of Library Administration. I also have a spot check for you, so you can share what's going on with you in your current situation, and also share your strategies for reducing low morale. Everyone, anytime, can share your story with me anytime. It's anonymous. You can join and add your information if you are job hunting and you have dealt with a low morale experience. I'd like to hear more about that. I have a Facebook community called Renewers. It's a closed group. Just look for it and you'll be welcome to join there. And I also have a website called Renewals, and that's where I just share what I'm doing with this research, talk about other items, and have other research topics and studies that are associated with it, and I share that information. And most importantly, I'm really honored and proud to share with you that I also facilitate and host renewal seminars and workshops for libraries and workplaces in general. So if you'd like to hear more about that and get a perspective for me coming to do that work for you and your organization, I'd be happy to talk with you. We have about 10 minutes for questions. These are the works cited. And like I said, I know this is being recorded, so you can revisit them anytime. Thank you so much for listening to me this last 40 minutes or so. I'm happy to take questions. I will do my best to answer them. And if I can't get to you, I invite you very seriously to send your email to me and your question to me directly at kaetrenadavis@gmail.com. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Yes, we do have some questions that have come in over the course of the presentation. If you have a question, please post in chat. Please also note that I'm going to be posting the link to the evaluation survey in chat, and also we will be sending that out as an email. So evaluation link just came into chat. We had a question about, someone says, I'm working in a system where most of the things you described are happening on a daily basis. As a new manager and as a white woman, what is the best way to make this better? Other than supporting my staff as best I can, has anyone successfully changed the culture of their library?
I have.
This is in a public library. So where do you start?
Yeah, so keep in mind you're a new manager, so it's going to be a while. This is a hall, okay? I don't know if anybody has changed their culture because I just started working on public libraries. It doesn't mean it hadn't happened. I just have not yet heard, and it is highly likely that I haven't heard because I just started working on the public library study, say last year, and this is the first time actually I presented this data publicly. So there's that. One thing I can say to you generally is I do have these professional development things going on, so I'm happy to talk with you about that. But also, one way to make this better is to acknowledge that low morale is happening. If you're a leader and you can acknowledge it, that's the first thing to do is we diagnose. So if no one's diagnosed it and said, this is happening, have you talked with folks individually about their experiences? Are their abusers still working in the library? Perhaps they're nervous about that. So think about it empathetically. And if you were being abused, how might you want somebody to approach you? So this is where empathy will come in and help you a lot. If you were being abused and neglected on a long-term basis, how might you want somebody to approach you? Probably in private, probably non-judgmentally, and also before you do anything, what is available to you for you to do as a manager? If you go to HR, what can they share with you? What will happen if you talk to them? So a lot of times, remember, HR is a limitation for abuse and neglect. So you don't want to promise things to people as a manager that may not happen in terms of resolving that instance for them. And also, I want to be clear here. If someone has to leave your library because they are being abused and neglected, make that easy for them. Make that easy for them. If you can't do anything to repair it and they have to leave, make it easy for them to leave. Help them find a new position. If they need help or support with that reference letter or whatever, help them get out of that situation. And that's regardless of race. As a Caucasian woman, note that you might be seen as an enemy, or you might be seen as an abuser. Have you looked at yourself to see what things you're doing paternalistically? Because a lot of things that people of color will talk about is the well-meaningness of white women. Well-meaningness also often plays out as paternalism, like I know what to do now because I know all the things. Ask them what they want. And that's just general. How do you want, what are you comfortable with? And that will play out for anybody too.
So to start with actually asking, what is the solution? What does that person want, rather than
and talking with the system,
deciding what they want as a manager.
Right. And also what can be done? What can you do? Because if you don't know what you can do for sure, like if you say, well, I'll just talk to HR and we'll just get, I'll try to work on so-and-so and this will be fine. But what if HR says, well, actually, we can't do that? Talk to HR first to see what your avenues are, and then talk to the person. Don't promise people that things are going to be resolved and they're not.
Okay. Another question we had was whether you had research on job precarity regarding ageism, particularly older women, in terms of inability to secure non-precarious employment, adjunct labor especially being an issue in the academic world.
Yeah. So I put back to the work site, and I think my screen is still being shared. You see that Bronze, Riley, and Henninger work? I encourage you to go to that website because they are bringing into the fold this idea of job precarity and how it plays out in libraries. And they have a whole website. They're gathering all sorts of data. So I encourage you to go there. It's been really helpful for me in framing my work moving forward.
Okay. Another question, more of the public libraries. Can this type of thing happen when librarians are continuously being abused by customers or patrons at the public library level? Not so much staff themselves, but abuse by patron.
Yes, and that plays into this idea again. The public library group was the only one that mentioned the verbal abuse, and what happens is this comes into administration not backing the public library, librarians, or the library employees working at the desk, downplaying what's happening at the desk. That's where the resilience narratives come in. So yes, it can happen, and I encourage you, everyone, no matter what, because I know we don't have a lot of time, and I don't think I'm gonna get all these questions. I want to share with you this. A area of self-empowerment that I tell anyone dealing with this experience. Document everything. Document things that you think that you know that they might downplay. Document everything that is happening to you that you perceive as workplace abuse or neglect, because someone else might be documenting too. And also, this is a methodology of self-care and self-preservation. People often believe that, oh, it's not really happening, or oh, that person was just having a bad day. Document everything. If patrons are continuously, if that's a big thing at a public library, document every instance of patron abuse so they can see in real numbers. I'm not just making it up. It wasn't just this one person, because we know we have in service places like we do. There's always, we have our special patron who's always X. It's not just special patron X, it's A through Z, and it's different types of abuse. And one of the ways they like to, and especially in the public libraries, people would say, well, they told me they was gonna go tell the board of trustees at A, B, and C. Well, you try to catch up to the board of trustees before they do. Take all the documentation that you can and show it. So that's one thing. And just in general, no matter who's doing the abuse or neglect, document every instance, every single one. And all of them are important.
Excellent point. Question again, going back to, if you're an administrator and you see a department manager engaging in poor behavior, entitlement, taking personal credit for work done by others or by the group, that sort of thing, how do you address that?
You're in a great position because you're the former leader and you are directly involved in creating the culture. So you create your boundaries about what you do not tolerate with colleagues and what you would like to see with colleagues. So if that means going, if I can't remember this person, if you're in an academic library or a public library, but if you're a former leader, you can, hopefully you can have in your toolbox the opportunity to create policies, to update policies, to create task force that that directly and indirectly tell your folks, your direct reports, your organization, what will and won't be happening as you're the leader. And this is where assertive communication comes in too. And I recognize that I'm not sure what this person is. This does not speak to this person, but we also end up moving through our leadership into our leadership roles with not a lot of guidance and formal leadership. And so I encourage you to go to LAMA to get guidance and get a mentor, and also recognize, assertive communication. If you've gone up the ranks not getting assertive communication, or you still feel kind of wonky about that, that's completely normal in our profession, because we often fall into leadership positions. So that's an area for you to figure out if that's something that you want to get more comfortable with, is sort of communication in terms of telling people what you expect from them and what you expect will not be happening as you are a leader in that position. But that's totally normal too. I recognize that.
Okay, well, thank you for that. It looks like we are at exactly 11:30, so we're out of time for further questions here. If you have other questions for the presenter, certainly please let us know, and we will be sending out the recording, the slides, and again, the survey for the evaluation is in the chat, and we will be emailing that as well. Thank you so much for attending. If you're scheduled for other sessions later this afternoon, we'll start back up at 1:30. And have a great rest of your day.
Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.